Thank you all for joining us today here at the Tower Theater. I know many of you, like me, are probably excited that we're here in person again. It's been a while. So I'm Allison Platt. I'm a board member with Building a Better Bend, and we are, again, so excited to be here at the Tower Theater with all of you this evening. I'd like to take a moment to announce some of our elected officials that are with us this evening. We have a group of counselors, so thank you, City Councilor Rita Schinkelberg, Councilor Anthony Broadman, Councilor Melanie Keebler, Councilor Megan Perkins, and then we're also joined here with Planning Commissioner Suzanne Johansson. Thank you all for being here. Building a Better Bend is a nonprofit organization that's been around for around 15 years. We have the mission of bringing expert speakers, like Chuck Marohn, to share their experiences and ways to positively affect the quality of life and of development in Bend. Many of our board members are also here with us this evening. Maybe some of those board members can raise their hands as well. If you'd like to learn more about Building a Better Bend and stay up to date on some of our future lecture series, please visit buildingabetterbend.org. Our free annual lecture series isn't possible without the generous support of our donors. Tonight's lecture is presented by the Bend Chamber. Our community is fortunate to have a chamber that actively partners with the city and community leaders to address long-term growth strategies. We'd also like to thank our partner sponsors, Project, Washington Trust Bank, and Central Oregon Land Watch. Make sure to check out Central Oregon Land Watch's booth outside the event so that you can become a member and support their work. And finally, thank you to our supporters, Stemich Design, Kittleson and Associates, Brooks Resources, Murray Smith Engineering, the Bend Metropolitan Planning Organization, and Killian Pacific. Please help me give a warm thank you to all of our sponsors. We'd also like to thank Dudley's Bookstore for being here in the lobby to sell Chuck Marohn's books. And after tonight's lecture, you're definitely going to want to get a copy. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Katie Brooks, CEO of the Bend Chamber. Katie's vision for the Chamber is to catalyze an environment where businesses, their employees, and the community thrive. Katie, go ahead.
Hi, how's everybody doing? Good? Are we ready to talk transportation? Is this one heck of a way to spend an evening or what? I love that there are this many transportation geeks in Bend. Yay, good for you. I'm really grateful to be sponsoring tonight's program. At the Bend Chamber, we've been working long and hard on a lot of issues that have to do with our incredible growth that we've experienced in the region and in Bend specifically. At the Chamber, we get the interconnectivity of land use, of transportation, of things that make a workforce strong, like childcare, and other amenities that make us one whole community, make happy employees, and make businesses thrive. And that's why I love tonight's lecture, is because transportation is inextricably linked to who we are, how we grow, and how healthy we are as a community. So this is a really great presentation tonight. We were really proud to co-sponsor the Political Action Committee, or the campaign for the GO bond, transportation bond that passed last November, and along with our fabulous partner, Mike Riley from the Environmental Center. And this just is one of those instances where we can take a look at some of the commitments we made as a community and hopefully make some good decisions on how we spend the money, where we put the money, and how we think about connecting housing, connecting people, and utilizing our transportation system wisely. So thanks again for having me here tonight, and so glad to be a sponsor. Thanks.
just so awesome. I can't even get over it. My name's Karen Swirsky. I'm a board member of Building a Better Bend. And again, thank you for coming tonight. And it's just so much fun to be in person, isn't it? It just makes a difference. I'm going to ask for your patience for a second here while I make my own confession. Chuck is talking about the confessions of a recovering engineer. I'm a planner. I've been a planner for a long time. And as a planner, almost every project I've worked on has included an engineer. And I will admit to being pretty intimidated by engineers. They have those initials after their name, and they have this big chunk stamp that they put on everything. And they're very quick to remind you that they carry liability, which they do. They also have lots of standards and guidelines and books, and now it's all on the internet, but they guide their decision-making, whereas planning is always a little more free-form. But I started to wonder about engineers, and this is quite a while back. And I'm going to tell you a couple of short stories about why. The first was, I was at an evening meeting with the traffic engineer. We were talking about a project, and we were coming back, and the traffic engineer was driving. We were traveling down a residential street in Bend, in an old part of Bend, where this posted speed is 25. And because it's an older neighborhood with not very many garages and such, people were mostly parked on the street, so the street was fairly well parked. And he said, "I don't like this street." I think his exact words were, "This street creeps me out. The city should take parking off of one side." And as he said this, I glanced over at his speedometer, and we were going slightly under 35 miles an hour. And I thought to myself, how creeped out would he have to be to drive the desired speed on this residential street? And then sometime after that, I was hired to do the planning work for a small cafe bakery in a very walkable neighborhood. I'm going to wager that most of you have been to that cafe. Part of the work was a traffic impact study that also had to look at parking. So I took the site plan to the traffic engineer. This was a long time ago, so he rolled it out on his desk. Now they would do it on a computer. And he took some measurements, and he did a few calculations, and he looked in this big green book, and he said, "This project is dead. So there's not enough room for the required parking." And I thought, really? This is such a cool little project, and it's kind of in my neighborhood, so I was really disappointed. So I asked him if I could look at the big green book. Now it's all online, but there was a big green book. And as I got into it and read through it, I realized that the parking requirements were based on an entirely suburban model. They assumed that this was a standalone use out in the burbs and that everyone visiting it would drive there. The success story is we got the parking adjusted and we got the project done. But I really started to wonder if maybe the engineers were using the wrong rules. So I want to be clear before I get myself in trouble. I have worked with and am currently working with engineers who are open-minded, humble, and very creative. So this is not a diatribe against the industry. And we need good engineers to keep us planners grounded in reality. But I have to say that when I found Strong Towns and started reading, I felt so relieved that I wasn't the only one worried about the rules, and that there were people who are articulating those concerns so much better than I could. So Chuck Marohn is the founder of Strong Towns. He's a professional engineer and a planner, and an alumni of the University of Minnesota, I have to say that right. In addition to being passionate about building a stronger America, he loves playing music, he's an obsessive reader, and religiously follows his favorite team, the Minnesota Twins. He started Strong Towns as a blog, remember those? In 2008. He was frustrated with the projects he was working on that he believed were actively harming the places they were supposed to help. As he gained readers, he realized there was a need for an organization that advocated those principles. Strong Towns became a nonprofit to, quote, support a model of growth that allows America's towns to become financially strong and resilient. His new book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, for sale in the lobby after this presentation, which I highly recommend. It's a treatise on how the values and priorities of engineers and other transportation professionals often differ from the values of the general public, especially when it comes to things like congestion and speeding. In contrast, the Strong Towns approach to transportation focuses on bottom-up techniques for spending less and getting higher returns, all while improving the quality of life for us, residents of the community. I think you're going to enjoy his perspective and maybe even be a little challenged by it and find new ideas and ways to think about how we build our city. Thank you for being here, Chuck.
Thank you. You did great. Hey, thank you. I've done like every mode of transportation today over the last like 14 hours to get here. And I recognize like I'm coming here, I've like, feel like I've been up for 2 days. And then I get here and everybody's so excited and so like pumped. And we're all together in a room, which is great because I spent the last year and a half doing these over Zoom, which is not as much fun as being in a room together. So thank you for the energy. Thank you for being here. And thank you for your interest in these ideas. Before we get started, I do want to say I've got a really good friend in the audience tonight. Will Dowdy is up at the top. He brought his daughter Lila here, and they drove 2.5 hours to be here, and I'm deeply, deeply honored. One of my good friends from the CNU, so I've learned a lot from Will and other colleagues there. Let's get started, because today it's running this nonprofit. I have people who are my bosses. And one of my bosses, one of my board members called me up today and said, hey, this big infrastructure bill passed. What are we going to do on it? And I'm like, okay, I just got off the plane. What are we going to do about it? Let's talk. I'm going to tell you right now. We have this conversation in America about our desire to do all these things regarding transportation, right? We want to fix our potholes. We want to deal with congestion. We want to make investments so we can have more growth. We've got safety stuff we'd like to do, and we just don't have enough money to do it. That's the essence of our conversation. We have these generations of people who seem to want different things today than they wanted a decade or two ago. We've got this group of retirees or near retirees that are having a different relationship with transportation than they have in the past. We also have this young group of people, this very strange group of people who seem to want different things than what we all wanted when we were that age. What do we do with this group of people? Well, you know, we could deal with these things if we just had the money. We want to invest in all these things that would make our transportation systems better, right? We want to invest in rail and buses and biking and walking. And if we could make all these investments, things would be so much better. We just don't have the money to do it all. The obvious solution to these problems is what? We just need more money, right? And the interesting thing about what Congress just did, if you read the I am so like not political. I almost like don't just avoid it because it drives, I don't want to get, but when I read it, what I read is the propaganda around this, right? And that's not a partisan statement. It comes from everybody. We're making these great investments. There's all a few years ago, the American Society of Civil Engineers came out with a report. The report said, if we want to, and understand, for those of you that don't know the American Society of Civil Engineers, kind of the go-to organization in terms of our national conversation on infrastructure investment. They wrote a report on transportation spending, and they said, to maintain our existing transportation system in a minimum tolerable condition, so that's a pretty low bar, right? To maintain a minimum tolerable condition. This is not to build anything new, not to make any of those investments we just talked about. It's just to maintain in a tolerable condition what we have now would be an additional $94 billion a year in spending. That's what they said, $94 billion from here on out. I want to give you some context for that because we throw billion here, billion there, $1 trillion, $2 trillion. It's all kind of gets murky after a while. The federal gas tax right now is a little over 18 cents a gallon. It hasn't been raised since 1993. Back, if you remember the days when we used to have to raise money in order to spend money, so that was if you don't remember that, ask your parents. Because that used to be the way things operated. It's not anymore. I can't say that I fully understand it, but back when we used to have to raise money, there was this conversation that we had about indexing the gas tax to inflation. And by the way, that was 2 years ago we were having that conversation. indexing the gas tax to inflation and allowing it to, in a sense, catch up with its buying power from 1993 till today and then keep it going at the rate of inflation. If we were to do that, the gas tax at the federal level would be around 30 cents a gallon. Just for comparison, just so you can kind of see how this system shakes out, we said, what if instead of inflation, we index to GDP growth? A lot of times we correlate transportation investments with a growing economy. If we indexed it to GDP growth, you would get around 30 cents a gallon, the same kind of rough number. What if we index it to the growth in traffic? Well, since 1993, if we index it to the growth in traffic, you would have a gas tax of around like 24 cents a gallon. So this gives you like a kind of a range of numbers. But what if we said, we're going to raise the gas tax enough so that we can pay for that minimum tolerable condition that the ASCE says? What if we're going to raise it so we can have that $94 billion a year that is needed just to maintain what we already have? Well, that would be a gas tax of about 78 cents a gallon. Understand what that number is. That's a static number. So everybody in this room understands when you raise the gas tax, people respond by driving less. When you drive less, you make less revenue. So if you have to make a certain amount of revenue, you need to raise taxes a little more. People will drive a little less. It becomes this kind of downward spiral. There was a Wisconsin DOT once internally did this study. They didn't release it, but someone sent it to me to take a look at. They determined in Wisconsin they would need an infinite gas tax with nobody driving. So the numbers didn't work out. That's what happens when you look at this in a dynamic scenario. The reality is we're never going to have a 78 cents per gallon federal gas tax, right? That same report from the American Society of Civil Engineers said, in order for us to have the transportation system we need, in order for us to have this prosperous transportation system that would do all those things we're trying to do, we would need to spend about $220 billion a year. They said if we don't do this, if we don't make those investments, families and businesses over the next decade are going to experience $1 trillion in losses. Most of it is lost time, stuck in congestion and extra wear and tear in a vehicle, but $1 trillion worth of losses. In order to avoid that $1 trillion of loss, they said we need to spend $220 billion a year, or over that decade, $2.2 trillion. That same study said over the next 30 years, if we fail to make the proper investments in transportation, our economy will grow slower than it otherwise would. And they said that will be 1 percentage point less of growth per year. So if you think about an economy growing at 5%, it would grow at 4. At 3, it would grow at 2. Over 3 decades, so that's a cumulatively huge amount of growth. When you look at that in terms of our GDP, and you understand that the federal government taxes roughly 20% of GDP every year, what this would mean in lost federal revenue over those 3 decades is about $540 billion. The federal government is going to collect that much less money. In order to avoid that $540 billion loss to the Treasury, the American Society of Civil Engineers recommends we spend $6.6 trillion on transportation. Now, I'm going to pause here, because this is the part of the presentation where people start to look at me strange. Chuck, you started out with people saying you were an expert. We were all excited. Now you're just telling us crazy stuff. No one writes a report that says this. Yes, they do. And we've actually reached a point in our discourse where it's gotten this crazy. Let me give you an example of what I mean on the ground. Highway 91 in California, one of the most congested highways in the world, but certainly in North America. We just spent $1.4 billion adding some additional lanes onto this highway. Here's how this project was reported in the local newspaper. The project will give some relief to drivers in the regular lanes, raising their average rush hour speeds from 8 miles an hour to 9.4 miles an hour. Nobody's life is any better because they can commute at 9.4 miles an hour instead of 8 miles an hour. But by the math that the American Society of Civil Engineers uses, and by the math that we use to analyze the value and the quality of transportation investments, You have 200,000 cars a day. Each driver is going to save on average 25 seconds. 25 seconds times 200,000 times 365 days in a year times 50 years that the project will be there times $30 per hour, which is the average wage and salary of a Southern Californian. And all of a sudden, this $1.4 billion investment saves Californians over $10 billion. That is absurd. That's absurd. But that is where we're at in this conversation right now. So when I show you numbers that are crazy, I want you to recognize that we are actually in a very crazy place right now. The bill that just passed, and again, I'm so over like the horse race. Like, I don't really care. If you are a very partisan person and you want to love this bill, that's fine. If you want to hate this bill, that's fine. I don't really care. I want to tell you some honest things about it, though. When the president's plan came out, last March, the American Jobs Plan, it identified in the plan 170,000 miles of federally supported roadway that was in poor condition. The president's plan proposed to fix, over the next decade, 13% of those roads. The plan that the president came out with identified 45,000 bridges that are in disrepair, in urgent need of repair. The president's plan, of those 45,000 bridges, proposed to fix 10,000 of them, okay? Now, what was the one thing that everybody said about the president's original plan? It was big, it was bold, it was huge, it was these eye-popping numbers, okay? And what have we done since then in bipartisan compromise? We've whittled it down and whittled it down and whittled it down. The original plan that came out last March only fixed a tiny fraction of what is already bad and backlogged. It's also building a whole bunch more. This is not a serious plan to maintain the stuff that the American Society of Civil Engineers is saying is an urgent need of maintenance. Our discussion everywhere, in Washington, D.C., in every state capital, is this discussion. Where do we get more money? Where do we get more money to continue to do the things that we're doing now? And you can go to most city halls, and it's the same conversation. What is the grant we can get? What is the program we can tap into? What is the tax we can raise? What is the budget item we can cut so that we can get more money to do more transportation? We need to start with a different question. And this different question will liberate us so that we can intelligently analyze where we are and plot a much more productive future. The question is, if we can't get the money, what then? If, and I'm going to quote the president and the bipartisan consensus in Congress, if the largest transportation investment in a generation is only going to fix a tiny, tiny fraction of what is already in poor condition, what do we do next? How do we deal with that? In order to answer this question, we need to understand our transportation system better. And part of that is recognizing where it comes from. You know, there's a sense that this system emerged as kind of a natural progression of technological changes. You know, we used to drive around in cart and buggies, and then we had trains, and now we have cars. And it's this natural, like, progression of things. And so a lot of times, because we were born into it, we rationalize what we see as being very, very normal. It's important for us to understand what the people who were putting this system together were trying to do, because it's very different than what we're trying to do today. The Great Depression was the most, you could take World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression sandwiched in between as this really consequential time particularly in shaping modern history. My grandfather lived through the Great Depression. He was a Marine in World War II. So he was one of the troops that went into Nagasaki after the bomb was dropped. He was a Marine. And that gives you like a sense of his age. He was a teenager during the worst parts of the Depression. I remember he told me that without FDR, he would have died. I don't know if that's true. That seemed like hyperbole. What I took away from it was that the Depression was really hard. He lived in a barn at the neighbors. His family couldn't take care of him. He wound up moving in with the neighbors. The neighbors let him sleep in the barn and would feed him. He could eat at their table with them. And in exchange, he would work the farm in Minnesota in the winter, right? So this was, a really hard existence. My grandfather said he was lucky. Again, the takeaway for me is that this was really hard. If you go back and you read books about the Great Depression, I think the fascinating thing for us is that nobody, even today, understands what caused the Great Depression. You can read a book that will go through all the causes and say, well, that's really, really smart. That makes a lot of sense. And then you can pick up another book and it will have a whole different set of causes and it will say, none of these causes are correct. Here's what it is. And you'll read that book and you're like, well, that's very smart too. We still debate it, right? There's no consensus. Even more importantly, nobody knew at the time how to get out of the Great Depression. The entire New Deal project was just an attempt to try many, many things and see what would work. What ultimately got us out of the Great Depression? What are we taught in grade school and middle school was the thing that solved, quote unquote, the Great Depression? What was it? World War II, right? We have this. And understand what World War II was. We took millions of working age people, we shipped them off overseas to kill and to die. We took millions of other working age people, put them to work in factories, building all the implements of war, the guns, the ships, the munitions, the tanks, the weaponry. We rationed sugar, we rationed butter, we rationed gasoline. This was not prosperity. But if you were like a bean counter in Washington, D.C., if you were like a spreadsheet jockey economist, and you had no sense of what humans were going through, you had no empathy for the human suffering, you just looked at a spreadsheet, you were like, wow, we made it. We made it out of the Depression. At the end of the war, as the war was winding down, the economists in this country started to freak out. And even I was listening to a podcast today about Paul Samuelson, one of the top financial advisors to FDR. He told the president, when this war ends, there's nothing different about our economy. Everything is exactly the same as it was. When we bring all these troops home and we shut down all these industries, we're just going to go right back into into the Great Depression. There's nothing different. Why would it not happen? Everybody in this room knows that it didn't happen, right? It didn't happen. What happened is we went and we did something different. We took all of this economic might that we had. I mean, understand who we were at the end of World War II. We were the last economic power not decimated by war. We were the last major industrial power that had our cities demolished and our industries, put under massive stress. We had the world's reserve currency. We literally had the gold, right? Like everybody shipped their gold to us, either because we sold them stuff and they gave us gold, or because they didn't want the gold in their vault because they were afraid they were going to get overrun and lose it, so they shipped it here. We had like the world's gold. We had more oil coming out of the ground than Saudi Arabia. We had a country united culturally against common enemies. Something that, for those of you that were around after 9/11 and you remember, Nancy Pelosi and whoever was the head Republican at that time, literally like arm in arm singing God Bless America on the steps of the Capitol. Absolutely bizarre thought today. Back then, we all felt together as one, right? That's what conflict does. And we took all of that capacity and we put it into this new project, this project of reshaping America, building a new version of the U.S. And the backbone of that were investments in transportation. We built the interstate system. We created local state aid programs. We pumped lots and lots of money into building all of the systems of growth. The problem that they were trying to solve back then was, how do we stay out of the Great Depression? The problem we're trying to solve now is so vastly different. The problem we're trying to solve now is we've had 7 decades of building stuff, and we built so much stuff, we don't have the money to maintain it all. It's not generated enough wealth for us to actually go back and maintain it. Our problem is so different. Our problem is, how do we make better use of all this stuff we've built? To do that, we have to understand the system we've created. I want to walk you through this system because, while it might have made sense at one point, it actually makes 0 sense today. And recognizing that will help us fix it. The backbone of our system today is this idea of the hierarchical road network. This is like a kid's drawing of a concept that we all intuitively grasp. We go from local roads to collector roads to arterial roads. We go from small streets to bigger streets to bigger streets. They all kind of funnel into each other in this hierarchical system. I want you to think of a watershed. Everybody in here understands how a watershed works. You'll have little ditches and brooks that will run into streams. Streams will come together and form rivers. Small rivers will form into major rivers. Major rivers come together to form large tributaries. We all get this. We all understand intuitively how this works. And we all understand that if you get rain throughout a watershed, if that rain is persistent enough or intense enough, where all that water comes together, you will wind up with a flood. This is Hydrology 101. And when I took Hydrology 101, they spend about 5 minutes on this concept because everybody understands it. But for some reason, when the engineering student leaves Hydrology 101 and walks across the hall to Traffic 101, we can look at the same exact system and be absolutely baffled when a little bit of rain on the edge of it, in the form of commuters, when it's persistent enough or when it's intense enough at one time, creates a flood. For some reason, this is baffling to us. If we set out to create a system to manufacture the maximum amount of congestion possible, this is what it would look like. We would take everybody possible in an area and we would bring them to the same point at the same time every day. And this is why congestion is a ubiquitous condition of North American development. In the city of Bend, you have congestion. In major US cities, they have congestion. In my little city of Brainerd, Minnesota, population 13,500, if you went out at 7:55 to the key intersection in the middle of the town and you asked people in their car, what is congestion like in Brainerd, Minnesota? They would say, it is horrible. We need to do something. I can't stand this. Look at all these cars. And 10 minutes later, there would be nobody there, right? This system manufactures congestion. We create the flood. And because we create the flood, we tend to react by over-designing, overbuilding, over-engineering. The flood is so damaging and is so ubiquitous that our reaction, our conservative reaction nonetheless, is to over-design. This is one of the things that I found most bizarre when I started doing engineering work. I always thought that a conservative design was one that took limited resources and did as much as you could with them. And I actually found out that a conservative design is one that overbuilds by a large degree so that you can prevent a future flood. The bizarre thing about this system is that at the point in time when we are experiencing the flood, at the point in time when we have the most demand for the transportation systems that we built, if you were to go up and take a drone photo of the network that we've created, about 2 or 3% of it would be flooded. And the rest of it, the vast overwhelming majority, would have tons of excess capacity. You cannot call a system like that efficient. You cannot call a system like that optimized. It is neither. In conjunction with this congestion inducement machine, we have adopted this idea, this principle of forgiving design. And this is another one of those ideas that solves a problem at the end of World War II, but now has become the problem itself. Forgiving design is a really easy concept. And it's actually one of the more brilliant things that engineers have ever done. If you think back to the early days of the automobile, automobiles would drive on paths that were former cart paths. So imagine driving a horse buggy through the woods, and you come up to a large tree or a big rock or a gully. What do you do in your horse and buggy? Yeah, you just go around it. It's very easy. It's very simple. You're going very slow. You don't take the time to move all those obstacles. But now, go out and slap a high-performance road surface on that path. So throw some gravel down, and then put a car on there. And what we were seeing is that the level of carnage was astounding. This year, the Transportation Secretary shared the number 40,000 last week. Pete Buttigieg, Secretary of Transportation, said 40,000. That's about right. The last handful of years, it's been between 35 and 40,000. Last year, even though driving was down, deaths were way, way up. We are likely to see around 40,000 deaths this year on America's roadways. That includes people getting hit who are not driving, people on bikes, people walking. 40,000. If we had the same level of fatalities today that they had in, say, 1935 for per mile traveled, instead of 40,000 deaths this year, we would have over 500,000. So early automobile driving was horrendously dangerous. The way that engineers dealt with this was to look at the systems they were building and recognize that drivers were human, and because they're human, they would make mistakes. And that as the designer, we could actually design the transportation system to take into account the mistakes that these humans would make and essentially compensate for them, forgive them with our design. Let me show you how this works. Let's say you have a two-lane roadway, car going in each direction. We understand that sometimes, for no real fault of the driver will swerve a little bit in the lane, will float a little bit. Maybe they change the radio. Maybe they look back in the back seat at their kid. Whatever it is, we know that sometimes you tend to float a little bit. We don't want a car that floats a little bit to go across the center lane and hit an oncoming vehicle. So what we do in a forgiving design is we widen out the lanes. We give people a little bit more breathing room on each side. Now we know and understand that sometimes for decent reasons, excusable reasons, drivers will go off the roadway a little bit. They'll actually leave the lane and go off the edge of the road. We don't want that to have them wind up like rolling over or falling in the ditch or whatever. We want to give them some recovery area. So we build on each side a little bit of extra room. So if they do happen to go off, they can get back on and continue on their way kind of unhindered. Then we recognize that for many, many reasons, a lot of them not really the fault of the driver, sometimes drivers will end up going completely off the roadway. And because car driving fast has a lot of kinetic energy, we need that kinetic energy to be dissipated before they run into something that will not move. And so what we do is we eliminate all the stuff that won't move. We create a clear zone on the side. And now you have a forgiving design. Let me reiterate, this approach has saved millions and millions of lives. It has been copied around the world, and it represents one of the greatest innovations and advancements in safety that engineers have ever done. The idea that we can recognize the common mistakes that humans make, and we can forgive those mistakes within our design. The problem with this comes when we take it out of the open roadway and we bring it into the city. Because when we bring it into the city, what happens is that we signal to drivers the wrong thing. We actually signal to drivers, like your story, I don't like this street. We signal to drivers that we got your back. We've corrected for you the mistakes that you make. we've actually designed out so you have a lot more room for error. And so what drivers do is they use that extra margin of safety to increase their speeds. And what we see is that in the randomness, the complexity of urban environments, death rates are going up, speeds are way too high, and we have this kind of statistical ongoing drudgery of tragedy that weighs us down. This is a function of the design technique that we have misapplied to our streets. If you go to the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, this is not the Green Book, but this is the what colloquially, internally, we call the MUT, or the MUT CD. This is the design manual that is used to design all the streets in your community. The Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices will say what traffic we use in which places, where we put different markings and all that kind of stuff. If you go to this manual, which quite literally has been used to design the street in front of this building, along with all the streets within your community and mine, if you actually go and say, well, what is a street and how does a street differ from, say, the highway? You look up the definition of street and you will see this. In the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, it defines a street as street. See highway. It makes zero discernment between what you would build on the interstate and what you would build on the street outside this building. That is what forgiving design has created, and we can do it differently. We don't have to be beholden to a system that doesn't recognize the difference between a local street and a high-capacity highway. Again, engineers are brilliant and have come up with many brilliant insights. It is the application of those insights that needs to evolve and change. One of the great insights that engineers have come up with is that driving is a System 1 activity. If you have read Daniel Kahneman, one of the greatest books I've ever read is called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He talks about the way the human brain processes information. And he describes two systems, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is the automatic system that you have for thinking. This is not your involuntary system that runs your lungs and your heart, but the way you process information. If I ask you, what is 1 + 1? You don't have to dig deep into your brain to bring that up. You know that, it just automatically appears. But if I ask you to add 4-digit numbers together, some of you might be able to do that very quickly. I'm not one of those people. Most of us have to sit, and if we were going to do that problem without scratch paper, we would have to mentally envision those numbers. We'd have to add them up in our brains. We'd have to force everything else kind of out of our brain for a moment in order to focus on that problem. That is System 2. Okay? Driving, and this makes a lot of activists very mad, but I'm sorry, that doesn't make it any less true. Driving is a System 1 activity. And driving has to be a System 1 activity, because if it were not a System 1 activity, humans could not do it. Humans could not do it for very long. The humans that can do it for a long time in System 2, they're called race car drivers or jet pilots, right? They're a very special kind of person. Most of us are not able to spend hours or even minutes in System 2. It's exhausting. And so driving is System 1. And understand how you drive. Make note of it the next time you're out in your car. When you're driving around, you will be able to hold a conversation with someone in the seat next to you. You will be able to sing along with a song on the radio. Things that we all accept are very normal and fine, and I'm not distracted when I'm doing this, yet you are distracted. You're doing something else. You're doing another like System 1 activity. But watch your own behavior. When you pull into, say, a busy parking lot, what happens to the conversation with the person in the adjacent seat? What happens to your singing along with the radio? You don't have to communicate this. Everything just stops. And it stops not only because you have shifted over to System 2, you are now focused intently on what's going on, but the passenger in your seat knows if they talk to you, you're not going to hear them anyway. They know you're not paying attention. That's because you're now in System 2. So, What engineers have recognized, and this again is something that advocates don't like, but that doesn't make it less true. What engineers have recognized is that humans will drive the speed that they feel comfortable driving. Regardless of what signs are put up, regardless of what regulations are put up, you may be able to put up some flashing beacon and get them to switch from system 1 to system 2 for a brief period of time. But we all know what happens when people get used to that thing being there, right? When people get used to it, they go back to system 1. And in system 1, they will drive the speed that they feel comfortable driving. And I want to add a little caveat to that too. That doesn't make them a deviant. That makes them human, okay? And so what engineers have done to set speed limits is they've said, when we go out and look at a roadway that we design, when we go out and look at something that we've built, what we don't want to have is differential in speed. We don't want to have some people driving really slow and some people driving really fast. So the way you set the speed limit is with this process. You go out and you say, are people driving over the speed limit? If the answer is yes, and it's not like everybody, it's called the 85th percentile speed. If the vast majority of traffic, 85% of people are driving at a speed or below, that is the proper speed limit. And here's the thing, that is the right way to set speed limits on a road. But if we go into the city and we look at a street, the question that we ask has to be different. We recognize that people drive in system 1. We recognize that driving is not a system 2 activity. We want drivers to drive the speed they feel comfortable driving. But what we also have to recognize is that in an urban area where you have all this complexity, where you have cars turning, cars randomly stopping, crossing, you have people walking, people on bikes, people in wheelchairs, you have random complexity, what we need is we need the speeds to be slower. And so when we go out and we look and we measure and we say, yes, people are speeding, the 85th percentile speed is above the speed that is safe in this neighborhood, the response on a street is to actually redesign the street. We have to signal to drivers what the safe speed is. And that speed has to be intuitive to them as they drive. And let me say this in a slightly more provocative way, and this kind of goes to your observation earlier. We want the driver to feel uncomfortable when they are driving at speeds that are not safe. That is how you build a safe street. It's not through lowering the traffic or lowering the speed limit, having the police officers sit out there for an hour, once a week, threatening enforcement, doing public education. We have to actually design the street so that when our humans, our very fallible humans, right, operating their vehicles in system 1, they have to feel themselves uncomfortable when they are driving at speeds that are above what is safe. At Strong Towns, we have a saying, if you need a sign to tell people to slow down, you designed your street wrong. The street needs to communicate to people what a safe speed is. If you go to any engineering manual, you're going to see a diagram like this. And this diagram describes the trade-offs involved in these different aspects of our transportation system. So we started out talking about the hierarchical network, going from locals to collectors to arterials. This chart describes, and I'm sorry for you that are not chart people, I'm an engineer, and so I think I have a contractual obligation to show a couple charts with each presentation. Is there any more? Yeah, there's one more. The other one's more fun, so this one is the boring one. You can see here the trade-off. Do I have a click? No, I don't. I started hitting buttons. This is not my clicker, so. You can start to see the trade-off here between the access you get on a local street and the mobility on an arterial. In a local street, you're in a place. And so you have a lot of access to what's there, but not as much mobility, not as much through traffic. When you get to an arterial, it's the opposite. You've got a lot of through traffic, but not as much of a place there. I want you to look at that middle area. The middle area where they got that nice sweeping curve that kind of describes having your cake and eating it too. You can both be in a place and be getting through a place simultaneously. When we look at this and we ask some questions about the return on investment or the financial productivity, what we see is that we can make really great investments at that far end of the spectrum. If we're building connections between places, we can make those investments and have those investments pay off. If we're investing in building a great place, we can make those investments and have them pay off. It's this middle area here where we're not investing in building a place and we're not investing in moving vehicles very quickly, that we spend a lot of money and don't get anything in return. Simultaneously, what we see is that these parts are very, very safe. If you're on an arterial, if you're on if you're on a highway or an interstate, what we see is that per mile traveled, it's some of the safest parts of the transportation network. You can go long distances with very low crash, very low fatality rates. When we're in neighborhoods and we're traveling at very low speeds and we're building a really great place with a lot of access, yes, there's a lot of crashes that happen, but they all tend to be fender bender, bump your door, that kind of variety. They don't tend to be people getting maimed, injured, having, deep, deep trauma. It's this middle area. It's this middle area where we are trying to have our cake and eat it too, where we're trying to be a place and get through a place, where all that complexity starts to intermix with high speeds that we have all the safety problems. This is where people are dying. This is where people are experiencing traumatic injury. This is where people are getting killed. Do you see the alignment here? We're wasting the most money in this place, and we're getting the worst results from a safety standpoint. Remember at the very beginning, the question that we were asking? Not how do we get more money, but how do we do things differently? How do we spend our money better? How do we make better investments? What I want to do is I want to take this chart here, and I want to kind of turn it on its side, and I want to make it into a different question. And the question is, at what speed do we create the most value? So this is the last chart for you non-chart people. On the bottom here, on the horizontal axis, you have speed. Very slow on this side, very fast on this side. Vertically, you have value. So at what speed do we have the most value? And what we're trying to demonstrate here is that we create the most value with our investments. In other words, we get the most return on investment. We get the greatest level of productivity out of those public investments when we are traveling at very low speeds, 15 miles an hour or less, or when we're traveling at very high speeds, 60 miles an hour and above. It's this area in the middle. This area in the middle where we're not building a place and we're not getting through a place, when we're neither moving fast nor building a lot of wealth. These are the places where we get the least amount of value. And removing these places from our toolkit is the number one strategy that we can have for actually making better use of the money that we're spending on transportation. That middle area is something we call a stroad. A stroad is a street-road hybrid. We call this the futon of transportation. If you think of a futon as being an uncomfortable couch that makes into an uncomfortable bed, a stroad tries to do two things at once, and it fails at both. It tries to be both street and road. What is the difference? A road you can think of as a replacement of the railroad, which, as the name suggests, is a road on rails, right? If you think about how a railroad works, in a railroad, you will get on in one spot and you will get off in another spot, and there's a high-speed connection between the two. We don't have frontage railroads. We don't have drive-through railroads. It's just a spot that you get on and a spot that you get off, and a high-speed connection. If you look at this picture, you can see that on this stroad, we've spent enormous amounts of money trying to move vehicles quickly, right? You have 4 highway-scaled lanes. These are very wide lanes. Remember, forgiving design brought into the city. You have a center turn lane. The center turn lane is designed to get that turning traffic out of the way so the through traffic can just speed right through unhindered. We have made massive investments to move traffic quickly. Does any traffic get to move quickly here? No, of course not. Why? Because we have artificially low speed limits for this design, and more importantly, we have a traffic signal. And the traffic signal makes you go 0 miles an hour for long stretches of time. We have invested enormous money to move people quickly. Nobody moves quickly. What is a street? A street is a framework for building a place. A street is and always has been a platform for creating wealth in a place. If you look at this street, there have been investments made here to try to make it a wealthier street. You have wide sidewalks. You have decorative lights that put out benches and pretty trash cans and that kind of stuff to try to make it a little bit nicer of a place. We've invested money here to make this a more productive place. Is this a productive place? No, because every business that operates here understands that everyone is visiting by car. And not only visiting by car, if they go to one business on this side, nobody is walking across 7 lanes here. Nobody is walking down the light, standing and waiting, walking across. This is a miserable place to be outside of a vehicle. So if someone is on this side of the street and they're going to shop over here, they get in their vehicle, they whip a U-turn, and they go over there. And so every business has a drive-through or a big parking lot, and what you see is that the tax base gets denuded, all of that public investment is underutilized, and we have really, really low financial productivity. This is called a Stroad. And if we had one goal from a transportation policy, it should be to eliminate Stroads. Because if we could eliminate Stroads, what we are doing is we are eliminating a transportation investment that is bankrupting our cities, and we would start to invest in transportation alternatives that build wealth and build prosperity. Going from Stroad to a street, or going from a Stroad to a road, is ridiculously easy. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to show you how ridiculously easy this is. But I'm going to preface it by saying the engineering part of it, the design part of it, is really easy. What is not easy is the cultural overlay we have on it. That's what's hard. That's what's tough. We all have grown up in this environment where we understand how it works. We intuitively get that when you build a new road and you put in a frontage road, and then you'll get the gas station and the franchise restaurant, and you'll get the big box store. And we have this kind of cultural knowledge. It's broken knowledge. It's bad knowledge. But we almost lack like an alternative set of understandings. That's what's missing. That's what we need to work on. It's not hard, though. The stuff that we need to do is actually not difficult. It's the way we talk about it and the way we understand it that's difficult. If we want to go from Stroad to street, the first thing we do is we slow down traffic. We actually redesign those streets so that we get that speed that we want to get. We prioritize people over through traffic, right? If you're trying to build a place, if a street is a platform for building wealth, a framework for building a place, we want the people who are in that place to have priority there over throughput of traffic. We want to build. We want to, number 3 is intensify adjacent land use. That's like a planner geek way of saying start building stuff, right? If you're going to build wealth, you actually have to build things. You have a beautiful downtown here, right? It's fantastic. But it's like a museum piece in your community. It's not like a functional downtown that is surrounded by an ecosystem that is like thickening up and maturing over time. If we want to build great streets, we have to build stuff. We have to thicken our places up. And then finally, we have to embrace the complexity. There is no like manual for building a great street. There's no set of guidelines. This has to be done street by street by street in a process that we call a street design team. But whatever process you use, it's one that is less rote and more complex. If we want to go from Stroad to road, it's just the opposite. Instead of lowering speeds, we actually want to speed up things. So we limit access. We eliminate those friction points that slow down traffic, that add complexity. We want to simplify this thing way down. We want to, and the technical thing here is segregate automobiles from other modes. We want traffic to move quickly. And so we want the least amount of friction. If you're going to have a bus, give the bus as much like dedicated space as you can. If you're going to have vehicles, give them as much space as they can without other interference. If you're going to have bikes along a road, the bike people get mad at me when I say this, but as an engineer, I cannot design a safe bike lane on the edge of a road where people are going 40, 50, 60 plus miles an hour. I can't do it. We should have bike lanes on roads. We should have ways to get between places, but they need to be separated facilities. There needs to be space in between them so that they can be done safely and efficiently. We need to resist the idea Did someone just whistle? That was kind of cute. It's okay. It's okay. We need to resist the idea that roads and corridors are for development. There's this perverse thing that we do where we make these massive investments in transportation, in getting from one place to another, and then we slowly mine that capacity for short-term economic gain. We have to actually resist to do that, and we need to recognize that roads are about the places they connect, not the development along them. We need to simplify our approach way down. We can do this. So let's go back to this. How do we solve this problem? How did we solve, because I'm not saying that we never have these problems, flooding, but we've come a really long way in our understanding of flooding and how to solve it. How do we today as a society and a culture approach this complex problem? We used to, and we're, in the western part of the US, so you're closer to this than I am. Yeah, we used to build dams, we would build levees, we would build dikes. We would go, violently shift the landscape around to tame it for our ends. Did that work? No, that didn't work. And besides all the other damage that came out of it, it actually didn't work. And what we're seeing now, in one of the worst tragedies to befall us, we're starting to see these dams that we built 50, 60, 70 plus years ago that were only designed to last. I mean, the engineers at the time would have told you this is a 50-year design. All of them are reaching the end of their life cycle, and we don't have anywhere near the money to fix them. And I mean, silly things like what's the dam that's near, the Orono Dam in California? What is it? Oroville, that's the one. Thank you, the Oroville Dam. We're literally, the thing that's wrecking that dam is that there's trees growing up and wrecking the earthwork that's holding it in place, basically undermining the integrity of it. To prevent that from happening, someone would have had to, 2 decades ago, go pick some seedlings out of the ground, when they were growing up. Instead, now you have these big trees, and they're like, what do we do with these? They knew this was a problem back then. We just lacked the capacity, the urgency, the competence to do what would have taken a team of high school kids 2 days in the summertime to do, now is a multi-billion-dollar problem. This is what happens when you build massive systems to solve these problems. How do we solve these problems now? We figured this out. What we do is we go out to the edge out here and we say, hey, you can't fill that wetland. You can't run that water right into the ditch. If you're going to do something here, you got to actually retain your water on site, allow it to soak in. You can't just run it all off because it will accumulate with everybody else and create this horrible flood. You can't do it. That's how we deal with this problem now. How do we deal with this problem? Well, we've said we're going to go out and add more capacity. We're going to build more lanes. The green solution now is to go out and say, well, we'll make commuting patterns. We'll take that, and maybe we won't build lanes, but we'll build a commuter train next to it, as if that will somehow solve the problem. We have all these big, huge top-down solutions. How do we solve this problem? Yeah, we give people alternatives to driving. We go out here and we say, hey, how about a corner store? How about a neighborhood? How about some alternatives to getting in your car and going someplace? And here's the amazing thing about that. What drives demand for local alternatives? Congestion does. When things are really congested, when it takes a lot of time to get somewhere, when it's not convenient to drive across town to get that gallon of milk, all of a sudden, what would really help would be a local store. All of a sudden, what would really help would be local services in my neighborhood. All of a sudden, what would help is to thicken up my place and make it more of a place. Congestion becomes our friend, not our enemy. Congestion becomes a thing that helps us rebuild our cities, not the thing we're trying to spend billions of dollars to fight. We have expended all the money we need to expend building massive highway capacity. What we need now is to thicken up our neighborhoods, to help them work again, to help give alternatives for us to respond to these problems locally. Let's talk about what that looks like. And the rest of this conversation is going to be about what those local responses look like, because what we need more than anything else, and you get this out of the first book that I wrote, is a development pattern that allows our cities to grow financially strong, to be more productive. Oregon has been a leader in this. And, I'm really proud of Strong Towns. We've been since the very first days of Strong Towns in 2008, we've been writing about the need to thicken up our neighborhoods, the need to allow the next increment of development. You guys have now statewide allowed single-family zone neighborhoods to have more than one home. Yes. That is a huge, huge step. There's other things to be done in here, right? But this is a huge step. At Strong Towns, we have a saying, no neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood can be exempt from change. Every neighborhood needs to be allowed to breathe, to grow, to change, to evolve, to respond to stress and opportunity in novel ways. Right now, we only allow our response to be in certain ways. Nope, can't thicken up that neighborhood, but we'll build more transportation over here. Can't do this, but we'll put in this facility over here. We need to allow our neighborhoods to develop into ecosystems, the way that they're designed to be, the way that we need them to function for us to be human. We have to systematically lower the bar of entry. We have, and I think it becomes, I'm going to say this amongst friends, it becomes more pernicious the further west we go. We have, through all kinds of good intentions, all kinds of compassionate means, raised the bar of entry to full participation in our society. Let me give you an example. This is something that in my community we call a tiny house. My ancestors would have called this a house. We have put the word tiny on as an adjective to describe something that for all of human history was just considered a starter home, right? You would build a modest little house, you're just getting started. You would save up some money and put on an addition. You would have a kid, your neighbor would come over and help you put on a second floor. You would go over and help them later. This is how we built cities for thousands and thousands of years. We have put the adjective tiny on this and said, uh-oh, starter houses, that's scary. If you want to build one of these, okay, we'll let you do it, but you have to meet all the requirements of a house. Then you have to meet subpart A through M of the tiny house ordinance. You have to go beg permission from your neighbors. You have to go genuflect in front of the planning board. You've got to prove that you're not some socially undesirable person that we don't want in our neighborhood. And then we'll let you build what is, in a sense, a starter home. If we tell everybody to participate in our city, you have to qualify for a 30-year mortgage on a securitizable product. What we do is we take a wide swath of our population and we say, you don't get to play the game. You don't get to be part of our community. You don't get to be a full member of what we're doing here. And not only that, I think we all understand the reinforcement mechanism that has on housing prices, on all these other things that we're struggling with now today. Let me show you another example. This is a shot from Muskegon, Michigan. These are little commercial properties. In Muskegon, Michigan, they had a problem in that their downtown had a bunch of vacancies. You guys have a very different problem, but let me explain theirs and then we'll relate it to you. They had a problem that they had all these vacancies in the downtown, yet they knew that they had all these entrepreneurial, creative people within their community. And they studied this problem, and what they recognized was that the bar of entry to the downtown was too high. If these entrepreneurs they had in their communities were going to fill those buildings, before they did that, first they had to do things like make the bathrooms ADA compliant, put in a sprinkler system, a commercial sprinkler system, all these other things required to meet the building code. Now, I'm not standing up here saying these are not worthy things to do, but if you're gonna ask an entrepreneur, and understand what an entrepreneur is, it's a crazy person with an idea for how they can be of service to others in the community and make a living doing it, right? That's what an entrepreneur is. If you're gonna burden them with being a developer first and taking out massive amounts of debt, it's just a bar they can't cross. They don't even know if their crazy idea works. And so what Muskegon did is they recognized we need to find a lower stakes place for them to get started. So they went out, they bought a bunch of storage sheds, they painted them funky colors, they filled in a gap they had in the streetscape, and they invite these startup entrepreneurs to come in and open up. Really, really cheap, $75 a month, $80 a month, something like that. No long-term leases, come as you are. If we got an opening, we'll take you. These places are always full. They're full of energy. There's all this stuff going on. And here's the amazing thing about Muskegon right now. Their downtown is full of businesses. And a lot of those businesses are people that graduated from this spot right here. You have the opposite problem of Muskegon. You are a wealthy community. You're a very desirable community. You have a high degree of affluence. And because of that, you have a lot of businesses that have filled in your downtown. I don't think you struggle with vacancies. You certainly don't struggle with them the way that a place like Muskegon struggles with them. Theirs is a poverty thing. Yours is different. But you've crowded them out as well. If I'm a crazy person with an idea, I need a rich uncle here, right? I need someone with money to sponsor me to get started. And so what we've done is we've sidelined a whole bunch of people. Because here's the one thing that we know about poor people. They are the most entrepreneurial, innovative people in our entire community. And they are that way because they have to be that way. They're forced to be that way to get through every day. If we create an on-ramp for them, what we will see is that we will create all kinds of opportunities and everybody will benefit from it. Last strategy. We need to fix our capital investment approach. Remember when we talked earlier about trying to solve this problem of how do we not go back into the Great Depression? We wanted to create this growth machine, go out and build, build, build. We're done doing that. We now have to go back and make better use of the stuff we've already built. And to do that requires a very different approach. One that instead of being top-down, where we put together a plan, we look for funding sources, we go out and execute said plan, we actually go out and do something fundamentally different. We look at where people are having a difficult time using the city as it has been built. At Strong Towns, we've created a 4-step approach to making the lowest risk, highest returning public investments that we can make. I'm going to walk you through that approach right now. Step number 1, humbly observe where people are struggling to use the community. Go out and with humility, observe where your neighbors are having a difficult time using the city as it has been built for them. I'm going to stress humility here. The idea is to take all the thoughts you have about what you're going to find and what you're going to see and what you think should be done and what your favorite project is, get rid of all of those and go out and do the walk a mile in someone's shoes. Walk with them. Have them talk about their life. Have them talk about where their hardship is. Experience where it's difficult to cross the street or where it's, oppressive heat or shade or whatever it is. Experience that with them. Try to understand where people are having a difficult time. Step number 2, ask yourself a question. What is the next smallest thing we can do to address that struggle? Resist the temptation to come up with a permanent solution or execute that plan you've got sitting on the shelf because that will solve this problem. Resist the temptation to make them the avatar for the thing you want to do. Instead, you're asking, what is the thing that we can do with the resources we have on hand right now to make this just a little bit better? What's the thing we can do with cones and straw bales and paint and duct tape, not to fix this forever, but just to give it a slight improvement? Step number 3, do that thing. Do that thing right now. Don't go out and hire a consultant. Don't send it to a committee. Don't study it for 6 months. It's a tiny little thing. Just do it. And then step number 4, repeat that process. Repeat it over and over and over again. Jane Jacobs describes cities as a co-creation, something we build together. And I think, when we look back at the age she was writing, that was an optimistic and I think fading way of looking at cities. Cities have become something that we as taxpayers pay for and have delivered to us. But a successful city is not like that. A successful city is a co-creation. It is something we build together. And by humbling our public improvement process, what we find is that we can make modest improvements to make things better for people. And then they will respond to that by showing us where the next urgent thing is. And we will deal with that. And then more people will show up and more people will show up. And we will be doing what Jane Jacobs called this sidewalk ballet, this dance between the community and the people making the investments on behalf of the community, working together to build a more prosperous place. If we do an approach like this, we cannot help but make great public investments. Investments that are low cost and are high returning and actually improve people's lives. I want to talk relatedly about, let me, the ending of this presentation always gets me like here. So when I get to this point, I'm very passionate about this idea because it truly is, when I went to school to be an engineer, you believe in your heart that you're helping people, right? Like that's what we're here for, that's what we're doing. And a lot of the stuff that I did in my community, I thought was helping to make things better, helping to improve things. And it took a lot to stand back and recognize that a lot of the projects that I was involved in, or a lot of the projects that I advocated for as an engineer and as a planner, were projects that I liked. They're projects that actually served me. And served me not necessarily because I drove that road or I, used that, but served me in the sense of like even my ego, right? This was my vision. It's a very difficult thing to go the other way. And we have to go the other way, and this is what this slide is for, because when we go out and we look at the places that are financially successful, when we go out and look at the places that actually are prosperous, when we go out and we measure where's the places in our community where we're getting the highest return on our public investments, they all have the same characteristic. We see the same thing in every single one of these places. What's the one thing that you see in every place that is financially successful? You see people, and you see them outside of a motor vehicle. To borrow a phrase from ecology, people are the indicator species of success. If you are seeking what success looks like, you'll know you're getting close when people start to show up. I want to walk you through the design process that engineers use to build streets. Because this is really the thing that today we can make the biggest change the most quickly on. When an engineer goes out to design a street, they start with an evaluation of what the design speed is. What speed do we expect traffic to move at? They will then ask a question about what the volume of traffic is projected to be. How many cars are we expected to handle? Given the design speed and the volume, they will go to the manual and open it up and say, what does the manual say is a safe speed? And then how much is this going to cost? It's these four values, speed, volume, safety, cost, in that order that are applied to the standard design process. And it is a hierarchy. It actually is a system that prioritizes one over the other. Because when you start with the one, before you get to the next, that is what a value system looks like. This is my street. This is where I left home this morning. On the right side there's a sidewalk that leads up to my front door. This is the street that I live on. North Street, 4th Street North in Brainerd, Minnesota. I want you to think for a moment about the street that you live on. I want you to picture what it looks like. And I want you to think about the way that you would approach designing that street. If you were sitting down at the table and you were going to design that street, the street was going to be completely ripped up and completely redesigned, what would you start with? What would be the thing that you would begin your design process with? Would you start by saying, what is the design speed that we're going to apply here? How fast do I want to have the vehicles go? What is the speed that I want to make sure that vehicles can attain on this street? Would you start with the volume of traffic? Here's the minimum amount of cars that we need to be able to handle on this street. Would you start with safety and what you perceived as being a safe design for that street? Or would you prioritize cost? How much is this going to cost, and will the design be cost effective? I want you to shout this out now. Would you prioritize in the design of your street speed, volume, safety, or cost? Okay. If you were designing a street now and you prioritize safety, that's the number one thing we want to take care of. Would you then prioritize the speed that vehicles would travel? Make sure you could get a minimum speed on that street, or a speed that met the design guidelines. Would you want to handle a minimum volume of vehicles? Make sure we could handle all the cars that were going to go down here. Or would you want to make sure that your investment was the most cost-effective one that you could make? If you were designing your street and you were going to prioritize, would you prioritize speed, volume, or cost? If you had to prioritize, we can have cars attain a certain speed, but we're going to have fewer cars travel through here. Or we can have a certain volume of cars travel through, but at a lower speed. Would you prioritize speed or volume? Do you see what you did here? Do you recognize what you did? You took the standard design approach and you turned it around. And I think it's quite unfair for me, because I've written here, these are the engineer's priorities. This is the engineer's approach, right? And I said, it's in contrast with society. I want to point out, engineers are actually a subset of society. And I've done this exercise with rooms of engineers. And you know what the engineers say? The same exact thing you just did. But it's not reflected in the way that they actually approach things. Because there's one big takeaway from this exercise. What is that takeaway? We will all accept lower speeds to have greater safety on our streets. Don't forget that. Don't walk out of this room and not embody that, because you're not alone. Everybody in here is agreeing with you. There is no reason for us to accept speeds that are higher than what is safe on our streets, because everyone around you agrees with you. We have this idea called complete streets. And I remember when complete streets first came out, I was working as an engineer, and my fellow engineers and I laughed about this. We thought, oh, how cute. Because streets are for moving cars. Why would we worry about, all this other stuff? It's a bunch of, hippies trying to get us to do stupid things. Seriously, we laughed about it. And then engineers stopped laughing about it at a certain point, and I'm going to tell you why. There's two reasons why. Number one, they could get paid more for doing complete streets. There started to be more money in the system if you would do a complete streets design. A complete street has more infrastructure to it, so it tends to cost more. I know the complete streets advocates get mad when I say that, but it's true when you're building more stuff. But the most important reason why engineers came to embrace the complete streets concept is that it actually didn't compromise the design process. The engineers were still able to use the same design process, starting with speed and volume, and then safety, and then cost. Complete streets has an Oprah-like quality to it, is the way that I've come to talk about it. You watch Oprah do her show, and everybody gets a car. You get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. And in complete streets, everybody gets a lane. Everybody gets a place. You're driving a car, you get a lane. You're parking your car, you get a lane. You're riding a bike, you get a lane. You're on a bus, you get a lane. You want to walk, you get a lane. Everybody gets something, and nothing is compromised. A complete street accommodates pedestrians in an auto-dominated environment. In contrast, a strong town accommodates automobiles in an environment dominated by people. It's people that make a place. It's people that create prosperity. It's people that are that indicator species of success. If we want to design great places, if we want to build strong towns, we have to focus on the experience of the human outside of a vehicle. If we do that, we can make astounding investments that are within our budget, that we can do right now today, without needing state money, without needing federal money, with the stuff we have right here. We can make astounding investments in building a better place. And when we do it, we'll actually be building a place we want to live in, one that will have a greater degree of prosperity for everybody. That is the essence of a Strong Towns approach. Thank you all for having me. It's been fun to be here with you. My team gets mad at me if I don't mention the website. Strong Towns all started out as a blog. We still publish 2-3 articles a day. We got 3 different podcast streams. If you want to get connected to what we're doing, all this stuff is free. Please go online and get connected to us. We'd love to have everybody here be part of our conversation.
What do you think of Roundabouts?
Oh, what do I think of
You may know
Roundabouts?
Bend.
Why
Bend,
is that a softball?
Bend has 42
No,
roundabouts.
I know. I was warned. So we need to think about roundabouts the same way we think about complete streets, right? I feel like it's a gateway drug to something better. Complete streets, I like. If you come to me and say, we have a complete streets policy, I'm like, yay, you've started to do basic diet and exercise, right? You're not there yet, but you're moving in that direction and it's a good thing, yay. I feel like the roundabout conversation is that same way. The best roundabouts that I've ever experienced are ones that are used as a transition between high-speed areas and low-speed areas. Once you get into low-speed areas, roundabouts tend to be superfluous. You don't need them as much, maybe a little traffic circle here and there to kind of keep things flowing, but you also don't need traffic signals. If that sounds bizarre to you, read chapter 7 of my book. I think traffic signals are the worst, the greatest abomination that engineers have ever created is the traffic signal. Roundabouts, if you look at the way we do them here in North America, we tend to design them so you can operate them at speed. So they'll have the geometry, the geometric proportions, the kind of sweeping curves of highways, of roadways. If you go to other parts of the world where I think they use them more elegantly, they tend to have tighter geometries because what they want you to do is actually go through at street speeds. We insist that roundabouts should be at highway speeds. I have not experienced all of your roundabouts, but I have experienced a couple now, and yeah, it's better than sitting at a 4-way stop. It's better than a stoplight, but you're really still designing Stroadish elements into them, and that is not helpful.
I'd be happy to take you on a tour.
Yeah, I would love to see some more.
Okay, Chuck, I think you can read those as well as I can.
What traffic engineering practices and standards would you change to prevent the building of stroads? That's a good question. Well, okay, I think let's disconnect the two parts of that question, because I don't think you have to change any engineering standards to stop building stroads. You just stop building. Let me put it this way. Bend, Oregon should not build one more linear foot of road or street in any of your lifetimes. You already have more than you can take care of. you already have more than you have the maintenance budget to handle. You will never raise taxes enough to fix them all. If you think you're going to fix them all, then you're counting on the state and the federal government giving you money to do it, which, if you look at the largest bill that's ever been passed on infrastructure, is not going to come to you with a bunch of money for street maintenance. It's not going to. And so there's no rationale for you to build another foot of this stuff. That takes no change in engineering standards, no change in engineering design. It just is a policy change. And you can make that policy change and have broad support from the community if you talk about it as, we don't like Stroads, we're anti this, we're anti that. You will get the growth people show up and they'll say you're anti-business and anti-growth. If you say, look, we don't have the money, I don't want taxes to go up to pay for infrastructure we can't afford, that's low return in investment. These are really bad investments for our community, and we're not going to make them anymore. The deeper question becomes, how do you take the Stroads that you already have, and you have some really, really bad ones, how do you take them and over time convert them into roads, and again, or into streets or roads? And again, you don't really need a huge shift in engineering standards. You just need to, in your design process, give power and authority in different ways. Engineers are not going away. We need them. We love them. They're going to keep their books and their Bibles, and they're going to have their heretics, and they're going to have all their internal religion. Let them have that. Just segment it off from the rest of the decision-making process. Yeah. So are we expecting like another, is that?
No, we have plenty of questions.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead. Give me another one. Yeah.
So I'm going to read some of these
Okay,
to you,
great.
old-fashioned like.
Yeah.
What are some of the tactics to accommodate transportation challenged by a railroad cutting like a knife through the middle of your town?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because we have that same thing in Brainerd. And I mean, we can go in multiple dimensions with this one, because like the biggest thing is the volume of the sirens, of the whistle when they come through town. But then we also have the traffic backing up. We have the occasional problem of the ambulance being on one side and the hospital being on the other side. There's a bunch of issues like that. I don't think any of those necessarily have like simple solutions to them. I would kind of, when I look at this in my town, and I'm not familiar with the layout in your town, when I look at it in my town, to me, the solutions that are thrown out, like we need an overpass over the railroad, which would be bizarre in my city. We need to spend, and I can't remember how much it is, but it's a huge sum of money to get the railroad to adopt whatever the silent thing is, and that would kind of screw up traffic flow and all that stuff too. I always come to the idea that my city was built on a railroad. If you go back and look at the way the old railroad town was designed, its peak, like its height, like it's the time when it was like the nicest place, when we had theaters like this in the downtown, when we had all the downtown shops, we had all this stuff. The railroad ran right through the middle of town with more traffic than it does today. I tend to be like, this is not the low-hanging fruit thing I'd worry about. Now, maybe I'm overlooking something here, and maybe there's something urgent, but I live 6 blocks from the railroad. And, when we first moved to the house we're in now, it woke me up in the middle of the night, and I have not heard it for 5 years and 11 months. So I apologize if that wasn't the answer you wanted, but.
Here's a good question. Where do you put the businesses that you see typically on Stroads?
You mean like restaurants? Car dealerships. Car dealerships. Big box stores. So let's, we can list a few more here. So here's a really amazing thing. Cities before Stroads had like most of those things, right? Like they had restaurants, they had fix-it shops, they had hardware stores. They didn't have them in big box format, But the big box format is a derivation of the Stroad. It's not the other way around. You didn't build the Stroad because there's a big box there. You got the big box because you built the Stroad. If you don't have the Stroad, okay, where are you going to get your toothpaste and toilet paper and bulk, whatever it is? People got them in other ways, right? So I think one of the things, this is when I talk about being like mentally stuck. One of the things that we have grown up in, this is so hard, and I respect the angst that this creates. Just this last week, I'm in this little Facebook, I won't even say it, an argument, little dispute because the arboretum in my city, so the nature preserve in the edge of my city where they took 120 acres for nature, and there's trails through there for hiking and skiing and all this. For some reason, they bought a digital sign that says, Nature Arboretum on it, and then it's got this massive sign that, has all the flashing lights and all that. And it was kind of like off-brand. I'm like, well, why? This is really ugly. Like, why would they do this? And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of people in the community that are mad at me. People who were, part of putting up that sign. And if I step back and I recognize that, this is going to sound, tell me afterwards if this sounds like an elitist jerk. I feel like our aesthetic has been like numbed sometimes to where we just like the idea of putting in another digital sign, and this time for like a nature preserve, doesn't trigger anybody to be like, whoa, maybe this is off-brand, or maybe as a nonprofit running a nature preserve that gets, $200,000 from the city government every year, maybe spending $150,000 on a digital sign is not the best idea. It's like we've been dumbed down a little bit. And so I'm not trying to look down on my neighbors and say they're too dumb to have this figured out, because I experience this too, like I get it. But when we look at all those businesses along a Stroad, and we go through and we're like, okay, there's this like litany of things, and we kind of feel like, well, that's part of our community. It must be part of our community. What do we do if we don't have this Stroad? Like, where would they all go? And I think that sometimes is our brains being stuck and not very imaginative. I think we should ask the question, what did people do to acquire these things before the Walmart and before the Target and before the big grocery store? And then what do people in other cities that don't have these, what do they do? How do they do this? And what you see is that there's a ton of other approaches to this that are just not part of our toolkit today. And quite frankly, we disallow many of them anyway. I would focus more on how do we get the obstacles out of the way so that you can build that corner store or respond to that demand in a different way.
As a member of community that is not on a city planning board or a commissioner or anything of the sorts, how do I build a strong town?
That is awesome. That's a great question. So I'm gonna answer that in two ways. The first one I'm going to say is that formally, Strong Towns is about to launch an initiative. We have this thing called Local Conversations today, and we're expanding that in 2022, and it is designed to help in exactly that way. So if people are in a place in Bend and I want to do strong town stuff, I want to make my city a strong town, how do I do that? We actually are having, you can think of it as like a mentorship program to help you build a team to start doing positive things in your community. And you don't have to be on the city council. You don't have to be an elected official. You don't have to be appointed to a committee to make a big, big difference. If I could just give one simple thing though, be present. You're all present here tonight. That's a huge thing. If you can, walk home instead of drive. Bike instead of drive. Well, the thing about like a culture of biking and walking and a culture of a strong town is that it builds on itself. A lot of people, when they see someone walking, it will be like, well, okay, I can walk. A lot of times when they see nobody walking, it becomes a scary thing. And so if you can be present and be the person who's out there, you become a model for others around you. And just keep building that. Keep building that. It might feel lonely. It might feel like you're the only one. Don't do it out of spite. Do it out of love, and other people will follow you.
How long do you have, Chuck? I have about 20 more questions.
I tell you what, I could do this for 2 more hours. So it's more about respect for you and your evening. I'm good. I'm a late night person anyway, so it is like 11 o'clock my time though. We're good. Keep going.
I have a chicken or egg question for you. Do you start with with changing street design or land use, or do you try to do them together?
Oh, yeah. Okay, great question. It's not a chicken or egg thing. The street design always responds to the land use, not the other way around. And this is one of the major things that we have backward in our system. If you look today, that idea of we're going to start with design speed, then volume, then we go to the book and say, what is that design? What that means is that you wind up with kind of a uniformity of street design, regardless of what the development pattern is or what the condition of the private sector investment is. I was going to say this really long thing. I'll make this one short. We need to do the opposite way. Chapter 5 of the book is all about street design teams and how we design streets. And the very first thing we do when we're designing a street is that 4-step process. We go out and we say, basically, where is this at today? Where are the buildings at? Where are the people at? Where are the people struggling? What is happening here? And we focus on that. I'm gonna carry this to its end, and I'm gonna trust that you will make the connections, because the end is kind of a radical statement. If you are a city, and this is a very common situation, and you have 25 cents on the dollar or 30 cents on the dollar of cash flow that you need to maintain all of your streets, what that means is that a lot of your streets are never gonna be maintained. They're never gonna be fixed. We have, in many ways, just flat out overbuilt our systems. And if you go back to Bend of the 1950s and 1960s, if you go back to Brainerd of the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of the streets that are paved today used to be dirt streets. They weren't even gravel. They were just a couple tire paths on urban streets. And you know why that is? Because the way you build a street is you actually have the public investment be proportionate and related to the private investment. And as the private investment grows, the public investment also grows. But it always follows. Today, we go out and we build massive public investment without enough private wealth to actually sustain it, and then we make that like our line that we won't back from. We're gonna back from all of it. And so, to me, focus on building a place, but when you go and do that street, the street has to be designed in relation to and proportionate to the stuff that's adjacent to it. If you've got 3 houses on a cul-de-sac, you should never have a 32-foot wide paved street. You should have grass with like 2 tire tracks. Because that's all that can afford with that level of investment.
Are there any model communities that you feel represent the strong town philosophy?
No. This is the most frequent question I get, and let me say it in a different way. Chuck, point us to the strong town. Where is it? And I get it sometimes in anger, and I get it sometimes in genuine curiosity. I think both are kind of unhealthy and miss the point. The one in anger is okay, Chuck, you're so smart. Where's the city that's done this? And then when you say nobody, they're like, see, it's impossible. This is all a pipe dream. It's just dumb. My answer, if you wanted to say, where is it? If you don't constrain me to time, it was Bend in 1945. It was Bend in 1950. We've been on this big experiment for the last 70 years where we've gone like way off course in what it meant to build a city. And now we're seeing like the ramifications of that. We've been forcing to come to grips with that. You can see at the federal level that we've gone from, like I said at the beginning, we're going to raise taxes to pay for infrastructure. We're going to borrow money to pay for infrastructure. Crap, we're just going to print money to pay for infrastructure. We're on this like trajectory of really like, just, like trying to keep it all going like a staggering drunk in a way. So we've all copied the same playbook, and we're all in the same fragile place. If you want to see what a strong town looks like, go back to what you looked like before you started to do all this crazy stuff. The other way it comes, though, is this genuine question of like, who can we learn from? And I know where that comes from. It comes from a good place. It even comes from a humble place sometimes. Like, where can I go and learn from? And there's all kinds of beautiful cities. There's all kinds of gorgeous places. You know, like I can point to you in any, Portland is beautiful. Downtown Bend is gorgeous. Salem, Eugene, I mean, they all have like great places. We can go all over and I can show you neighborhoods that are beautiful and gorgeous and really work well. But the reality is none of them are you, and none of them are where you're at. And the biggest mistakes that I see in planning and development and city-led growth is when you go and copy the thing that is working in some other place. The way we make good investments is we start with where our people are struggling today. And that's unlike any other city, because your people are different than people there. And so I resist the idea that there is a place that that has it figured out, but then a place that we can copy from, because we have to be done copying. Go ahead.
Okay, we have time for one more.
Great.
And this is probably your second most asked question. How do you talk to people who see every attempt to move away from car-centric design as an attack on cars and driving?
Yeah. That's awesome. Let me rephrase it. How do we get that dude who drives the Hummer and shows up at our meetings and yells at us? How do we get him to ride a bike? You don't. You don't live in a city where you have to have, 99.9% of people support what you do. You don't. In fact, if, in any city, 5% of the people are really determined to have something happen, it will happen. And that's just the reality. But I think that the answer to that question, if we're being strategic, is that that's not the low-hanging fruit. The way you build a culture of biking and walking is to start with the person who would really, really like to bike or walk, but has a tiny obstacle keeping them from doing it. And you remove that obstacle. And the way you identify and remove that obstacle is that 4-step process. Because there's someone out there biking and walking today that's overcoming that obstacle, but it's a struggle. And if you remove that struggle, it's easier for that person, but it's also easier for the person who is sidelined to now do it too. And if you do that over and over again, you start to build a culture of biking and walking. And then when you have your meeting or your decision or your vote or you're trying to figure out what to do, the guy driving the Hummer who's like, this is anti-business, this is anti-growth, I don't like this street, shows up. And he could talk on the microphone. We can listen to him. But then there's a litany of 40 people who show up who say, I love what you did over here. I like this. Can we do more of this? I'm trying to walk across the street and I feel like I'm going to get run over. My business is here. And boy, when we slowed down traffic, I sure got more customers. You're in a long-term project. That person is the person who is going to join you by having all of his neighbors join you first. And that's okay. We can bring that guy along. But we don't start with that person. And we don't spend a lot of time worrying about that person. We can love them and we can respect them and we can listen to them. And I think those are all healthy things. But changing their mind, I don't waste any time on it. I don't worry about it. I'm just going to say something. You can tell me if this is going too far too. No, I won't say it. I feel like Jesus did not start with Pilate, right? He did not start with Herod. You start someplace else and you build. And that you can build something, then you can get to something that will then, change the entire Roman Empire, the religion of the entire Roman Empire. That's how you do it. So don't start with the guy in the Hummer who thinks you're terrible and won't listen to you and doesn't like your street. Now, if he's your city engineer, give him the book. Tell him he's got to watch this thing. But, you know, if you read the book, what you find is that the strategy for the engineer is just to stop asking them to solve problems that you don't need them to solve. Engineers are really good at some things. They're really good at telling you, here's the type of pavement I would use here. Here's how we solve this drainage problem. They're not good at saying, you know, here's what the best use of this public space is. Don't ask them that question. Don't give them that question to ask. Don't give them that question to answer. That's how we solve that problem. And so you have tons and tons of capacity to actually steer this in a different direction. Don't get hung up with the guy in the Hummer who's going to show up at your meetings. Thank you, everybody. I'm gonna go sign books.
That's right. We wanted to thank Chuck for this presentation, which was everything that I hoped it was going to be, and more. Recognize our sponsors again, especially the Bend Chamber, Project, Washington Trust Bank, Central Oregon Land Watch, Stemic Design, Kittleson and Associates, Brooks Resources, Murray Smith, the Bend MPO, and Killian Pacific. And today's lecture has been recorded and will be available on our website soon. So if you know someone who wasn't here, who should be, you can point them. And don't forget to go out and buy your book and have Chuck sign it. Thank you so much for coming.